everyone, and thank you for joining us in our study of Genesis chapter 41. Now, there are things in this life that we go through that cannot be explained. There are things that happen that leave you scratching your head and you're wondering why, what in the world's going on here? And as we go through these things, sometimes we can look back behind us and see how and why God made things turn out the way that they did. And sometimes we aren't given the answer on this side of eternity, but our lack of understanding does not mean that there wasn't a reason for it. For example, in the book of Job, he went through a series of terrible ordeals, and in a short period of time, the devil took everything away from Job except for his wife. Now, after we get to know his wife a few chapters later, that seemed to be the cruelest part of the trial. In the end, though, God made everything better for Job, and he restored everything that he lost. And now we know from the first couple of chapters why those things happened to him. We have the luxury of knowing what's going on behind the scenes and the reason why. But Job didn't. He never knew. Even after his trials were over, we don't see where God sat Job down and shared a cup of coffee with him and explained to him why all this stuff has happened to him. Just because Job didn't understand it doesn't mean that God was not sovereign over the events that took place. And don't forget that it was Satan who did all of the evil to Job, not God. God allowed it to happen temporarily, but even the devil is on a leash and he can go no further than what the Lord allows. But now look at what Joseph has gone through. He has lost his mother as she was giving birth to his younger brother Benjamin. His father showed favoritism to him, which put him at odds with his jealous brothers. And then the dreams came. God showed him what he was going to do, but God never said when it was going to happen or how long it was going to take, and he never said exactly how he was going to make this come about. Joseph ended up being thrown into a pit by his brothers. He was stripped of the special robe that his father had given him. His brothers sat there and ate a meal while leaving him there in that pit to die, but a merchant caravan came by, and his brother Judah decided it's better to sell their brother as a slave and make a little bit of money rather than let him die in this pit for nothing. When Joseph was a slave, he did everything right, and he was blessed, but he was still a slave. And then despite his integrity and his faithfulness and all of his hard work, he was wrongly accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. He did everything right while he was in prison, and he was promoted to a special position there, which led him to be able to help a guy get out of there. But that guy forgot about Joseph, and he was still a prisoner. He had these dreams at the age of 17, we're told in Scripture. By this point, Joseph is now 30 years old, and just when you think things couldn't get worse, they do. We never read of Joseph complaining or doubting God, which is amazing considering his circumstances. Wouldn't you be tempted to break after that last little bit? God was obviously doing something. He gave these two servants of Pharaoh very terrifying dreams, and then he gave Joseph the ability to interpret them, and everything came to pass exactly as Joseph told him. So it was clear that God was still with him, and God is doing something. He's doing work through him. But you know, he had to wonder, why didn't you get me out of here too? He just predicted that this man would be freed and restored, and yet he's still there himself. Wouldn't it be hard not to think, Lord, that was our chance to get me out of here? What just happened? Now, just like in the first two chapters of Job that explain the events that took place in his life, this chapter is going to shed light on all that's happened so far in the life of this awesome and faithful young man. And as we go through and things become clear to us, may we find the faith to trust in God the way Joseph did. Even when we don't understand why things are the way they are, don't give up. And it doesn't matter if we ever understand in this life the reason that we go through certain trials or experience certain things. Just rest in the knowledge that, brother and sister, you belong to the same God who orchestrated these events in Joseph's life. And one day, like Joseph, you will be able to say, the world meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Or as Jesus told Thomas, because you have seen, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. So let's begin this study of chapter 41 with the first 7 verses. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Verse 1 says that it was 2 full years later. 2 years after that man was restored that he interpreted the dream for, but yet he forgot about Joseph. Joseph told him to let Pharaoh know that he is being held here under false pretenses. Now, I assume that cupbearer would not be allowed to speak unless spoken to, especially after just being cleared of whatever accusations and charges that he was imprisoned for and that the baker was killed for. But the text actually says he forgot about Joseph. Maybe it's the excitement of being restored that caused him to forget. I don't know. Maybe it was the fear of speaking up. Maybe he's a selfish person. Or maybe the time wasn't right yet, so God could have caused him to forget. Suppose that he had gone and done what Joseph had asked right when he was released from prison. There's a chance that Pharaoh would not release him. One conversation with Potiphar would explain why Joseph's in prison, and then that might bring out an execution that Potiphar didn't demand because he liked Joseph. Or there's the possibility that Pharaoh would release him. Then what would happen? Well, naturally, Joseph's going to go home. If Joseph was a free man and he returned to his homeland, everything that he had endured for the last 13 years would be for nothing. But remaining in prison, when God's timing was right, the cupbearer would know exactly where to find Joseph when the big moment arrives. That big moment is finally about to happen 2 years later. Where we begin, Pharaoh has had 2 dreams back to back, and he was left troubled. In the last chapter, we covered the subject of dreams given by the Lord. Long story short, it's still possible that God will communicate to people that way, though it's very rare, and it should always be handled with discernment. Sometimes dreams are just dreams, and they don't mean anything. Usually they happen because you just went through something, or you talked about someone, and then you had a dream about them. The Bible does say that in the end times, your old men will dream dreams and your young men will see visions. But in Scripture, we counted that at least twice the number of dreams from God were given to unbelievers. God gave dreams to his people too, like Daniel, both Joseph's, and a few other people, but they didn't have a Bible like we do today. The majority of dreams that were given to people like Nebuchadnezzar and to the servants of Pharaoh and Laban and Abimelech and now Pharaoh himself. If we want to receive a direct revelation from God, open your Bible. There's a lot of counterfeits out there cashing in on dream interpretation. And before you believe anyone that offers that, tell them to tell you what your dream was, just like Nebuchadnezzar did. He knew that his magicians would just make up an answer to save their skin. His magician said, "This is impossible." But it wasn't impossible for God. God told Daniel what the dream was and the meaning. But while it's still possible on rare occasions for God to use dreams to reach people, dreams should never replace the Bible in authority or importance. And a dream from God will never contradict the Bible, like the one Joseph Smith claimed he got when he founded the Mormon Church. But back to our text here. Pharaoh has a disturbing dream, and apparently he woke up in a panic. Maybe he got a snack, thought about it for a little bit till they calmed down. Then he goes back to bed, just kind of washed it off. And as soon as he did, he had a second dream that was so similar in many ways, but it had different subjects. The first dream, 7 fat and healthy cows coming out of the Nile River. Well, that's disturbing for itself because cows just appear like they've been scuba diving. Then while they're eating, 7 poor and thin cows also come out of the water and they hate the fat ones. So now we've got swimming cows that are carnivores and cannibals. No wonder Pharaoh woke up disturbed. And then the second dream followed the first one very closely. A single stalk of wheat produced 7 heads from the same plant. Now that's really incredible. Usually the best you're going to see is maybe 5. So this plant was in a thriving environment. It's a sign of a good harvest. And then a poor looking set of 7 heads of ears of grain consumed those good ones. Now, after that, I bet Pharaoh woke up and said, "That's it. No more dill pickle chips and ice cream before bed." Talk about some crazy dreams. But to him, it was obviously more than just a dream. Usually, when you have a nightmare, you wake up and you feel relieved the second that you find out that it was just a dream. Maybe within the space of a few minutes, it'll leave your mind, and by the end of the day, it's completely forgotten. But not this dream. Something about it shook Pharaoh down to his very core. And I'm not saying that this is the case with every dream that looks like that to a person, but in this case, it's definitely from God. Something is coming that will affect not only Egypt, but many other nations. And God is not going to let the memory of this dream just float away and be forgotten, because the events in that dream predicted are right on the horizon and about to happen. Let us continue on in verses 8 through 14. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, "I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us in there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted it for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, and he hanged him." Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. First thing in the morning, Pharaoh is still troubled. So he calls all of his magicians and all of his wise men. He should have told them to bring their horses too, because this sounds like something out of Humpty Dumpty. All the king's horses and all the king's men. What were those horses supposed to do anyway? But anyway, these Egyptians were highly superstitious people. They worshipped a wide variety of gods. Some say around 1,400 up to 2,000 different idols and deities. So he called the ones that he trusted to be experts in dream interpretation, but like Nebuchadnezzar's men, they weren't able to figure this out. These men who call themselves diviners or seers, they fit into 2 categories. 1, either they're a fraud that just took educated guesses, or 2, they dealt with demonic spirits trying to discern things. But God's not going to let either one of those get even close. Just like Nebuchadnezzar's men, they're drawing a complete blank, because like Joseph told the cupbearer and the baker in the last chapter, interpretations belong to God. God made sure that these so-called wise men won't get any intel through their demonic channels. He scrambled the signal, to use technological terms. In verses 9 through 13, though, the cupbearer speaks up. He basically gives a personal testimony of his encounter with Joseph, and it includes details that Pharaoh would recognize as true. He remembers 2 years ago having thrown 2 of his servants into prison. Perhaps someone had tried to poison him, and the obvious suspects are the men who handled his drinks and handled his food. Pharaoh also might have remembered on his birthday, as evidence came to light that convicted the baker and cleared the cupbearer. And here it was told to Pharaoh that they both had dreams 3 days prior to that verdict, and Joseph predicted what was going to happen from those dreams. It happened exactly as he said it would and when he said it would. Now we understand why God allowed Potiphar's family to falsely accuse Joseph and to get him thrown into prison. God not only removed faithful Joseph from the constant daily temptation of Potiphar's wife, but he placed him in a position to where he could impress this cupbearer. And when the timing was right, the memory of Joseph returned to this cupbearer, and he knew exactly where Joseph could be found. So in verse 14, they go to get Joseph, but they've got to clean him up a bit first. Now, I understand that Joseph was in a good position within this prison, so I'm sure he got a few hygiene privileges or a few extra meals that other prisoners did not. Perhaps he got to bathe every so often. I highly doubt that anyone in there ever received a change of clothes, so the outfit that he has worn for the last 2 years is probably going to need to either be washed 30 or 40 times or probably just thrown away. I bet there are a lot of wives out there that probably do the same with their husband's laundry. You might look at your husband's clothes and you're, what happened? Did you hit a deer? And you just throw it in the trash. Besides cleaning Joseph up and getting him new clothes, they also shaved his beard. Now later on, this would be considered an extreme insult to an Israelite man to have his beard forcibly shaven off. Matter of fact, a command is later given to the men in Leviticus 19:27 that the beard is not to be cut. In those times, even other nations knew that this was a supreme insult. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, there's the account of David's envoys being humiliated by the Ammonites. The Ammonites had shaved off half of each guy's beard and cut his robe where his rear end was exposed, kind of like a hospital gown, but worse. David told them to remain in Jericho until their beards regrew and then they can come back. But when Joseph was shaved, he didn't complain. He's had worse done to him in the past. I don't think he understood fully at that point what's about to happen to him. But the Egyptians didn't have facial hair like the Hebrews. So I'm sure if it was just a quick trip to Pharaoh, just in and out, that's not going to require a shave for everybody. But this was a sign that Joseph was not coming back to prison. He is going to be where he's going for a while. He is about to become a prominent person in Egyptian society. So it's necessary for him to endure this final humiliation to receive the blessings that he dreamed about so long ago. Now let's get verses 15 through 24. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. Yet when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I saw also in my dream, and behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Pharaoh doesn't beat around the bush here. He gets straight to the point, and he tries to affirm that what he has been told about Joseph's ability to explain dreams. Yet being ever faithful, Joseph gives credit where credit's due. In verse 16, he says, It is not in me, but God will give you a favorable answer. Joseph's not taking any credit. He's not trying to make a name for himself. He knew that this encounter was big. This was a pivotal moment, not only in his life, but for the future of many nations. But he made sure that among all of those false gods in Egypt and all of these idols, the one true God of Israel is going to receive the glory for doing what those idols could not do. Does it not look like Joseph has matured a lot from the way he used to handle himself around his brothers? He is much humbler now than he was before. So Pharaoh repeats to Joseph what the dream was. He didn't make him guess what the dream was, like Nebuchadnezzar one day would do to Daniel. But that didn't matter anyway, because God had rendered the others unable to understand what the dreams meant. To us, it looks obvious, but that's because we know the story, and we have the Holy Spirit dwelling in us to help us discern and understand God's Word. But at that moment, before it's all revealed, if anybody had any idea of what Joseph was about to say, I don't think they would put themselves on the spot and take a guess at it. Remember why he explained those 2 dreams to those people in prison? When he was there, he put a timestamp on that. 3 days, one's going to be restored, and in 3 days, the other one will die. If 3 days go by and there's no results, Joseph's going to look like a phony. So if the cupbearer had heard this and offered an educated guess from his previous experience, and he tried to interpret this dream, okay, Pharaoh, we're going to have 7 days of good weather and 7 days of bad. Or in 7 days, rabid cannibalistic cattle is going to kill our cattle and eat all of the crops. But when 7 days would come and go without change, he would join the baker with his body in the town dump. Even if somehow someone discerned that the sevens referred to years instead of days, that's still putting a lot at stake trying to interpret this. Let's continue on into verses 25 through 32. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh that he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. Here, Joseph has been given the ability once again to instantly tell what the dream was about and what it signified. He didn't need a night of prayer to receive an answer. God gave it immediately. 7 years of great harvest is coming, beginning right now. Thus, another reason that Joseph remained in prison for those 2 years after the cupbearer was let out. They would all soon realize how abundantly everything was starting to produce. It would be crystal clear about the first half, but only time would tell about the 7 bad years that were coming. Joseph realized that if they waited until the first bad year to begin preparing, it's going to be too late. They've got to start taking action right now. There's a lot of discussion in Christian circles about prepping or stockpiling goods and supplies in case of a disaster like this famine right here. Some people see common sense in being prepared for anything, and some people will say it's a lack of faith in God's ability to provide for them. So there's people on both extremes of this. Those that are against prepping will use the parable that Jesus told about the man that had the plentiful harvest. He planned on building more storage for everything that he had, and that night he died. But the motive of that man was selfish. He was just planning on hoarding everything so that he could have a life of ease and no longer have to work. Here, the preservation of many lives was at stake. If actions not taken now, Egypt would not survive. Neither would the many other nations that are coming to Egypt to buy food that they can't find anywhere else. To make sure that Pharaoh would take this seriously, Joseph continued speaking. Now, this is a bold move. Pharaoh had only asked him to interpret the dreams for him. He had not asked Joseph for his opinion as to what course of action to take. By suggesting what should be done, Pharaoh could take this as an insult against his capability to provide for his people as a leader. But Joseph went ahead and gave him the framework for a plan that would ensure Egypt's survival and the survival of many others, including his family of Israel, which is the whole reason for Joseph being sold into slavery to begin with. Without everything that has happened to Joseph, his family would have starved to death after they had consumed all of their flocks trying to survive in the first year of the coming famine. Let us continue on with verses 33 through 40. Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land for 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. Now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and as wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you." Joseph would have made a fantastic prepper, and I think Pharaoh recognized this. Not only was Joseph's advice wise, he had also shown through the ability to interpret the unknowable that God was with him, and that Joseph's God is the real deal. Nobody in Egypt was calling on Ra or calling on other idols. This was all on the God of Israel and his chosen man for the job. So Pharaoh told Joseph, "Great idea. Congrats on your new job." I bet Joseph wasn't expecting that. Maybe he just thought his purpose in life was to prevent millions of people from starving. So interpreting this dream, giving Egypt a fair warning, that would have been enough for him. But God sometimes gives so much more than we expect. I think about Moses. I wonder if Moses was just as surprised when this same thing happened to him. God met Moses in the wilderness in a burning bush, and he says, "Moses, I'm about to deliver the people from Egypt." Moses would be like, "Okay, that's wonderful news, Lord." Then the Lord would say, "And I'm going to have a showdown against Pharaoh and against his musicians, and I'm going to do great wonders. I will set the nation upside down and free the people from bondage." I can imagine Moses, "Great, this is awesome news." Then the Lord commands to Moses, "Now go and do as I have just said." Moses was probably caught off guard. Is like, "Excuse me, did you just tell me to go do all this?" Joseph was given the authority to do his suggestion exactly the way that he said it should be done, or suggested it should be done. And Pharaoh said in verse 39, "Since your God has informed you of all this, there is no one as discerning, as wise as you. Now you go and make sure this job gets done." So let's see how that turns out in verses 41 through 46. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, "Bow the knee," and he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. Way back in verse 34, Joseph suggested that 1/5 of the grain should be taken and placed into reserves. Now, ancient resources say that Pharaoh usually took 1/10 of everything as a tax, but this would be 20% instead of 10%. Joseph was, in a sense, doubling the taxes of the people. Now, the harvest is going to be so plentiful that nobody's going to notice or be left hurting during the 7 years. It's not going to cripple their economy. But for a foreign Hebrew man to be responsible for a 20% tax imposed on them, that could be hazardous to Joseph, especially if people didn't know the level of authority that had been given to him. So Joseph was given the signet ring, which is a huge thing. Joseph could approve or change anything with the power and authority of Pharaoh. The garment and the gold necklace would also be a display of prominence, and then being paraded around town in the second chariot behind Pharaoh, introduced personally by their supreme ruler. That's going to remove any doubt of Joseph's authority. Nobody's going to mess with him. And in verse 43, he had the people bow before Joseph. And I wonder if his dream from so long ago popped into his head. Well, I remember sheaves of wheat. I remember the stars, which I thought was my brothers, but I didn't imagine all of these people bowing to him. And then with a declaration from the people's leader himself, everything was settled. Nobody in Egypt would dare to refuse a command from Joseph. So Joseph was given a wife as a sign that he is now a full-fledged member of that nation as well as that dynasty, I would dare say. Now, this woman that he was married to, this Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. First, Potiphar is not related to Potiphar in any way. Their names both mean Ra has given, referring to their sun god Ra. But this does seem like a problem here, doesn't it? Because Joseph is married to a foreign woman who is not from their own lineage. And on top of that, her father was a priest to a foreign idol. Well, some of the ancient rabbis had a problem with this, because just a few chapters ago, we seen the problem of Judah intermarrying with the people and Esau intermarrying with foreign nations. The ancient rabbis seen that this was a problem, so they scrambled to come up with an explanation that was legitimate. They proposed this theory, now this is just a theory, that she was the daughter that was born to Dinah following her rape by Shechem. Now this is an excerpt from some of their writings, and I quote, "Jacob's sons wanted to kill the infant, lest it be said that there was harlotry in the tents of Jacob. Jacob bought a gold plate, and he wrote on it the episode with Shechem. Jacob hung the plate around Asenath's neck and sent her away. God dispatched the angel Michael to bring her to the house of Potiphar in Egypt." And then there's another account that says that the baby was left on the wall of Egypt and Potiphar heard it crying and took it in, just like in the case of Moses in the river. But by holding to this, they can say that she was a member of the family and therefore an acceptable wife, and she was led here to Egypt ahead of Joseph. Now, I wasn't there myself, so I can't say otherwise, but to me, that sounds like an awful lot of effort going into a cover-up. But what do they have to say about King David having a Moabite woman named Ruth in his lineage? What about Rahab? What about Bathsheba? Myself, I align with those who see her as a convert to Judaism. She is definitely about to see the hand of Joseph's God in Egypt, and God has just been proven to Pharaoh, and trust was placed in him as God's servant. Now, there were many devout women who converted in Scripture, so why scramble up to cover this one in particular? Just take it as it is. Joseph married Asenath. Joshua wed Rahab. Boaz took Ruth for a wife. Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Let the Scriptures say what it says. Now let's continue on in verses 47 through 52. During the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Now before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he says, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. He named the second Ephraim, for he says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The first 7 years have gone by, and it's clear to everyone that there's an abundance of grain. Every city had storage built for the grain from the fields that surrounded it. As time went by, more storage had to be added, and the harvest continued being so prosperous, they could no longer keep a record of how much that they've got. Verse 49 says the grain was like the sands of the sea. They even stopped measuring it. I mean, it was just too much. It took too much time to weigh it and to count it. So they just started dumping grain in anything that would keep it dry and secure. In the final years before the famine began, it says Joseph became a father to 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Both of them would become tribes of Israel when they returned to the promised land as a large nation. Joseph would be excluded, his name would be excluded from most of the list of the 12 tribes, and his 2 sons would be put in there in place of him and in place of Levi, who were priests and had no need for the land. But let us get these final verses right quick, 53 through 57. When the 7 years of plenty which had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was a famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, you shall do." When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the earth. It was more than obvious during the first 7 years that Joseph was right. Never before had they seen such a great harvest, and then the famine that was to follow was the most severe that the world had seen and will see for a long time to come. It's a good thing that they didn't delay in preparing for the worst when that revelation was first given through Joseph. They're going to need every bit of that 20% to take it through. When the famine happened, it was so severe that everybody just quickly run out of food. Verse 55 shows us that all the people who had likely also saved up in their pantries also run out. I think of Joseph's family back home. Was there an abundance of crops to give them a head start? I don't think so, because they also faced this unprepared. You might think, well, they had large herds and flocks and all of these things that they could eat. That's only going to last so long. There's no pasture to feed them. There's no water to support these livestock. Now, with no grass for them to eat and people needing what water there was for themselves, the livestock are going to die first. Now, you can't sell them for any money because nobody had any means to support the animals, and you could only eat so much at a time. Without the means to preserve and process them fast enough, all of these animals are going to die of starvation and dehydration in the fields, untouched. Pharaoh saw that Joseph had been right this whole time, and he kept him in charge. In verse 55, he says, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says, you shall do." And in verse 57, people came from all over to buy grain from Egypt. So verse 56 said he also sold to the Egyptians. This food wasn't free, even for their own citizens. Now you might think, well, that sounds unfair. But factor in the cost of building all of these storehouses and everything else. The Pharaoh had to pay for all of this to be done. And plus the income from the other nations, all of this stuff that they're accumulating is one day going to be plunder for the nation of Israel when they leave Egypt 430 years later after being forced into hard slavery. Now, I'm sure the people didn't argue too long, though. What good is gold and silver if you're dead of starvation? Despite that 20% tax, there was enough of an abundance that the people of Egypt should have had a fair amount of money themselves. It's all going to be necessary for them to survive the bad years. So it might sound like Egypt is getting rich off of the back of starving people, but it was God that gave them that increase to begin with, and it was this action that is going to keep everybody alive. On that note, you might wonder, if God is in control of everything, why couldn't he have prevented this famine in the first place? First of all, he easily could have. There's nothing that God can't do, except for sin, of course. But in the past few chapters, we saw Esau depart from the land and blend in with the people of Mount Seir. Judah had married into a Canaanite family and ended up in a real big sinful mess themselves with sons that were far more sinful than he was. And then there's the whole mess of Simeon and Levi slaughtering all of the Shechemites and killing them. Reuben sleeping with his father's concubine and all sorts of stuff. Everything is crumbling and falling apart for Abraham's descendants. The land of Canaan was promised to Abraham and his descendants forever. But if God didn't do something quick, they're going to blend in with the other nations and soon forget about God as well as lose their distinct identity. Along with their heritage, if that disappears, so does the promised Messiah. And today we would still be lost in our sins. God had to get them out from among the Canaanites before they became one with them, just like Esau did. And to do that, the place that they were going to come to was Egypt. Now, yes, Egypt was also a pagan nation, and it had far more idols than Canaan did. But after Joseph is gone, and a new king is over the land that didn't know Joseph or his people, the people of God are going to keep to themselves in the land of Goshen there in Egypt. For 400 years, they're going to toil as slaves, but they were isolated from the idolatrous people that lived all around them. And when they leave that land, they're going to be wealthy beyond measure as they plunder the Egyptians, and they leave a mightier nation than when they arrived. In the coming chapters, we're going to see that 70 members of the family of Israel arrive. But when they leave, counting the women and the children as well, they will be over 2 million in number when they leave.